So first of all, everybody, welcome. Welcome to talk about an alternative to native apps, and especially how to test progressive web apps. And yep, there it is. Let's first take a look at the agenda. I first want to give a short introduction about myself. Then I want to dive a little bit more into the subject, why I've chosen this subject. Then also look into the alternative, think about a strategy for progressive web applications, and also come with some automation examples. And if you've never heard of a progressive web app, or basically the abbreviation PWA, then you should definitely listen till the end. So hopefully you will get enough information to put in your backpack and maybe use it in your current assignment or your next assignment that you might have. So first of all, a little bit about myself. My name is Wim Selles. I'm a senior solutions architect at Sauce Labs, and Sauce. Oh, hey. Oh, yeah. Well, I'm doing fine. How are you? You sound a little bit like Joey. What happened to you? Hey, I'm doing fine, thank you. Okay. Oh yeah, sorry. Sauce, this time I do not have any DVs about Friends. I know Friends is basically my favorite series, but today, yeah, I need to disappoint you. So. Oh, yeah, sorry. Okay, see you. Like I mentioned, my name is Wim Selles. I'm a senior solutions architect at Sauce Labs, and basically my role within Sauce Labs is to help customers get the most value out of the product that they bought. And that could be talking about automation strategies, for example, for PWAs, but it could also be doing code reviews, helping them automate difficult situations. That's basically my day job. What I also love is to contribute to, for example, open source. I'm a mobile lover. That's why I have this mobile dude t-shirt, also wearing this t-shirt. But I really love mobile. I love open source. It was also one of the reasons why I joined Sauce Labs, because by contributing back to open source, the community, fixing bugs, helping other people by answering basically the questions that they had. Yeah, they found me and they asked if I wanted to work at Sauce Labs. So it was really a dream coming true. I'm also the contributing author to 2 chapters in 2 different books. A friend of mine wrote 2 books, and he asked me to write a chapter in it. And in the first book, I wrote a chapter about how to use open source software within large organizations. And in the second book, I wrote a chapter about how to use Appium together with React Native and some best practices about it. And if you want to order it, there are a lot of good chapters in those books. You can order them on Amazon. I'm not earning any money with it, but yeah, if you want to order them, please do, and hopefully you will find them also interesting. And like I also mentioned, I'm also a JavaScript lover, so I create a lot of open source packages to help other people with their automation. But yeah, enough about that. If you want to know more about me, you can follow me on Twitter, or you can follow and see what I'm doing on GitHub, on my GitHub page. But let's go to the first part, basically the introduction. And we're talking about an alternative to native applications. But before we can dive into the internal alternative of native applications, let's first take a look at what it takes to develop a native application and try to come up with maybe some pain points if we're talking about developing a native application. And when I was thinking about this, I was like, okay, we can divide it into 3 pain points or 3 points. Development of your application, distributing your application, and also fragmentation of mobile devices. So let's first take a look at the first one. If we're thinking about developing a native application, yeah, then we need to have the skills. We need to have people in our teams or in our company that can develop an iOS application with native iOS SDKs, or who can develop an Android application with Java or with Kotlin. And you might now say, okay, it's not really needed. We've got some alternatives to develop native applications. Yes, you're right. We can use Flutter, one language, the Dart language, to develop an iOS or Android application, or we can use React Native, where you can use JavaScript, the thing I really love, but JavaScript to develop native applications. So the skills might not be that such a big pain point anymore. Then you've got your environment. You need to have, for example, a Mac to develop at least iOS applications. You need to develop them, you need to test them. But I think one of the biggest pain points, if we're talking about developing native applications, is at least distributing your iOS application, the security and the certificates that you have. You need to know them all. If you develop an application, the things you could do, the things you cannot do. And that could be a real pain point when we're thinking about developing native applications. And you might have heard me already say distribution. Yes, distribution is also something that can cause some pain points. Think about releasing an app. And in the beginning, Ashwini already mentioned web applications. And with web applications, we mean just a website that you can host on, or you can view in your desktop browser or maybe in your mobile browser. And if we think about releasing an application, especially a web application, then we can easily basically push a new fix to production. We can easily push a bug to production and roll it back at the same time almost. It's pretty easy to do the distribution part for web applications. But when we're thinking about the distribution part for native applications, then we have some challenges there. Just think, for example, about the amount of people we have that have our application, but maybe different versions. How will you get all the feedback from all the people? How can you make sure that everybody is on the latest version of your application? Not everybody automatically updates versions of their applications. So if they have a bug, they can have a bug for a year. So think about that when you're thinking about distribution. But what's also very important, before you are on the phone of the customer, you need to think about the app review that Apple or, for example, Google is doing for you. Think about the time. It is not that you have your application in the App Store within a few minutes. Apple, for example, can take up between 24 hours and even 6-7 days. Android is a little bit faster, Google is a little bit faster, but that can take some time. But we also have some rules, things you can do and things you cannot do when you're developing your application and try to release it. And that's something I want to get back to in a few slides. But I first want to talk also about the fragmentation, because what's also a pain point when we're talking about developing native applications is, we have a lot of specific devices. iOS, in this case, is maybe our biggest friend because they have a limited set of devices, screen sizes. So it's pretty easy to kind of like test your application on different devices. And also the biggest advantage of iOS is that almost everybody updates to the latest major version within a few weeks. I think the latest version after 3 or 4 weeks, we were around 75% of people. Well, think about Android. There are still people using Android KitKat 4.4 from, what is it, 10 years ago. So that might make it more difficult to do the testing also on real devices. The fragmentation here is kind of like the pain point. But like I mentioned, rules. I want to get back to the rules, and I want to kind of like explain that based on a quote. Because when I think of rules, I always think about this one. Trust me, you cannot play the game if you do not know the rules. And if you do not know the rules, someone's bound to get hurt. This one is from Alison Noel. If you want to know more about it, the link is there. I will also share the slides afterwards. But this made me think about something. And maybe something that might be familiar for at least a few guys. I'm not a big gamer, but some people might know a game that, or at least a company that didn't thought about the rules or thought that they could do it differently. And that is Fortnite. If we're talking about games, if we're talking about rules, you might have heard the story of Fortnite, where they tried to create their own way of doing payment in the Fortnite application because they thought that and Google and Apple were taking too much commission. They asked 30% commission on every in-app purchase. And they were like, okay, but 30%, that's a lot. They're earning a lot from us. We want to have that money. But yeah, there is a rule. And the rule is that you're not allowed to create your own payment. You need to let all the payments go through or Apple or through Google, because then they can assure you and also the end user that, yeah, basically everything is safe. So they were almost, they were banned. They were not allowed to install the application again through the App Store or through the Google Play Store. It was even, how do you say it? There was even kind of like a point in time where Apple said, if you basically do not stop, we will stop and we will block you completely. Basically, also the engine that Fortnite is using is being developed by them and also being used by multiple other games. If that engine was gone, kind of like the game world would be lost. Gaming on your phones or on your tablet was not possible anymore. So this was quite a fight here. And you might have seen it also in the news. Oh, so, hi, Sasbot. Are you gaming now? Oh yeah, I was playing Fortnite. Oh yeah, cool. Ooh, did you know that we have more than 1,000 free trial sessions that started Fortnite? Ah, cool. That's a fun fact. So basically, our people are using Sauce Labs free trials to run Fortnite on Sauce Labs. Do you also know why? Yeah, kids are smart. Yeah, you might have seen this, that during the pandemic, kids are at home and they've got a Chromebook, or we as parents are restricting our kids to play games. We block stuff in the Chrome browser, and yeah, kids are very smart. If you would now kind of like start a free trial, you're able to run it on Sauce Labs. But nice fun fact. Okay. See you. All right, bye. And if we're talking about a fun fact that Sasbot was telling here, I also want to tell you a fun fact about how Fortnite tried to solve this, tried to solve playing the games still on mobile devices, and at least on Android devices. They basically had a contact with Samsung. And they did something that a few Apple lovers might recognize this box. This is the same box you would get if you would get, for example, if you would buy a MacBook, you would get this box. And basically they transformed it a little bit. And they went to a big influencer and they asked him, can you basically post this? Because you're still allowed to download Fortnite on Samsung devices and download it through the Galaxy Store, through the Samsung Store. A nice way to do this, but still, I wonder if this is the right way to look at it. Maybe we need to think about using a different technology or something. And that also brings me to the next point, because there was a second big company that wanted to do something different. They wanted to use they wanted to introduce the Xbox cloud gaming. And for people that are not familiar with gaming, basically they allow you to run multiple games through one application on your phone or on your tablet by just streaming them. But if you have also followed the news, it was, I think, beginning of this year or end of last year, Apple said, well, we're not going to allow this. You're not allowed to stream content, and especially games that we did not authorize to run them through a streaming offer. And this was kind of like strange. It was also strange for me why they did this, because if you would look at Netflix, everybody might have a subscription for Netflix. Netflix is basically doing the same, or Spotify. It's basically streaming content, which is also not being authorized by for example, Apple. They're still allowed to do that. So this decision was a little bit strange. On the other hand, it was somewhere hidden in the rules. But what I really liked about this one is that Microsoft thought about something different, thought about this in a better way than, in my opinion, Fortnite did. Because they announced this a few months ago in April. They said that you could now play the games on iOS devices and also on browsers. So not downloading on desktop browsers. So not downloading an application to stream the games, but basically just using a browser. And you might think about, okay, how did they do that? How is that possible? Well, if you would read the article, then you would see that they say we're now allowing you on iOS to stream it, because you can now do that through browsers. You can now play the games. And this brings me to the subject that I want to talk about, PWAs, because the way they are doing this is with the alternative. But before we dive again into that alternative, let's first take a look and compare two things, because I mentioned we had native applications, the streaming, for example, the streaming example for iOS. They were not allowed to do that in native applications. And we also have the other part, web applications. They're now using a web application. And you might wonder, okay, but if we would think about pros and cons about both, there are some gaps maybe. So let's first take a look at this. If you would look at native applications, then one of the pros, the biggest pros, they're rich and reliable. They've got a very good standalone experience. And just think about it for yourself. If you can, for example, order clothes for a retail store through the browser, you can do that through an app. Personally, I love to use an app, so I don't need to use. I lose, for example, the address bar, the toolbar at the bottom. It gives me way that it's more relaxed to do the shopping. You also have the advantage to access hardware. You can, like I mentioned, it's visible on your home screen, your docs, your taskbar. So those are all advantages of native applications. If you would then look at web applications, then there's a different advantage for web applications. They're always up to date. If you, like I mentioned, if you push a bug to production, which was not intentionally, so you need to revert it, you can just revert it. If you do that on native applications, you're doomed. You need to basically make sure that your customer is updating your application. As long as he already installed it, well, it's pretty hard to remove that from his phone. Also, the advantage of web applications is that you can reach anyone, anywhere on any device. It doesn't matter if we're talking about desktop, if we're talking about mobile devices. It's pretty easy to reach them. And you can even use all the search engines, like Google, you've got DuckDuck, you've got all types of search engines that could index your application. So all the content in your web application is still searchable. Could help you kind of like sell your clothes, for example. And like I mentioned, a single code base. Just update it once and you can use it everywhere. If we would kind of like use a graph for this, where we would say, okay, we've got some capabilities and the reach, then you would get something like this, where you would see, okay, native applications, they've got a lot of capabilities. Web applications have a very good reach to people. But if we're talking about, basically PWAs, how should we position them? What's the difference between a web application and a PWA? Well, first of all, they kind of like fill the gap. They've got a lot of capabilities and they've got a lot of reach. So let's take a look at what a PWA is. And a PWA is basically just a web application. The difference between your normal website and a PWA is that it uses modern APIs. With those modern APIs, it has the possibility to access certain hardware things on your device, like the microphone, like the camera, the vibration mode, for example, or even Touch ID or fingerprint. So that's really nice. And if you would also look at PWAs, they've got three pillars, which is capable, they're reliable, and they're also installable. And let's dive into those three pillars. Oh yeah, and last but not least, anyone can use it anywhere on any device with a single code base. And there is SalesBot again. So even, you can even use it on whatever device you want to use, even on the iPhone that you've got there. I hope that's good for you. Oh, cool. Can you show? Yeah, I will show you that in a few minutes. I think that more people want to know more about it, not only listening to the theory, but also want to see how a PWA works. So I will show you that in a few minutes, also for the rest of the people. But yeah, see you, man. I also want to, like I mentioned, I want to dive a little bit more into the three pillars of PWA: capable, reliable, and installable. And if we're talking about, for example, capable, then we need to think, for example, about things like geolocation, device orientation, and motion camera, kind of like all the access to the hardware that you would normally not have with a normal web application. PWAs give you more access to it. Then if we think about reliability, then the advantage of PWAs in comparison to web applications is that they have a very fast loading time. And what I mean with a very fast loading time is that they use extra caching in the PWA that you would normally not have on your website, on a normal website. If you just visit a PWA for the first time and then visit it again, it uses the pre-cached information, and only if it needs to update it based on the code that the developers write, it will be updated. That makes kind of like, that helps you making the experience for your end users much faster. And then also one of the things that's really important is that there's an offline mode. That means that if you're driving in a train and you're going through a tunnel, 9 out of 10 times you have a bad internet connection, or even in a train you could have Wi-Fi, but the Wi-Fi is really bad. In offline mode, there is a offline mode. You can just use your application when you're offline. As long as you visited once before, then you could still use the application, search for data. You can even order stuff, and then when you have a connection, the order will be sent when there is the connection over the internet. And also it works on any browser. And I want to get back to that also with the capability, because you see the asterisk there, works in any browser. It basically every functionality depends on which version of the browser the end user is using, but there's always a good fallback. So it will not be that there's no situation where your application will be completely stuck. You might not be able to use a certain hardware feature, but you could still use the application. So PWAs can add something extra on top of that. The only thing that we need to have is an end user that has the latest version of Chrome or the latest version of Safari on his mobile phone. And then last but not least, and I think this is very important, it's installable. I think this really makes a difference, because it's not, if you make an installable from a PWA, it's not like having a bookmark on your screen, and if you would then open the bookmark, that you would still open the Safari or the Chrome browser. No, it's really an application on your phone. And like I mentioned, personally, I really love to use applications instead of using the internet on a browser, because, well, the experience is better, in my opinion. PWAs give you that extra experience. And yes, I'm now going to show you how that is. What you see here, this is the installable. And you might wonder, how do I create that one? I will explain it also later on, but this is basically our Sauce Labs saucedemo.com website. If you would go to the saucedemo.com website on Android or on iOS, then you can say create an installable, and then you would have an application on your home screen. And as you can see here, you don't have the toolbar of Chrome or Safari. You don't have the address bar at the top of Chrome and Safari. So a really relaxed experience when you want to use your application. And when we're talking about this, you might wonder, okay, how should I test a PWA? What should I think about if I need to test a PWA? So let's take a look at the strategy, and then in the end, I will also show you how to create that installable, and maybe even also how to automate that installable. So first, let's take a look at the strategy. If we're talking about the strategy, there's one thing that you need to keep in the back of your mind. Like I mentioned at the beginning, a PWA, Progressive Web Application, it's just a web application, meaning you can just use the strategy that you already have if you need to test a web application. So there's nothing new there. Keep in the back of your mind, it has some extras, and we need to test those extras. That's the one thing that we need to do. But basically, that's the addition to the web application strategy. So there is a list. There is from PWA, you can find it on web.dev. There is a list, a core PWA checklist of things that you can verify when you're going to or manually test or automatically going to test PWAs. And in this case, for example, verify if it starts fast and if it stays fast. Does it work in every browser? You can even test it now on Chrome on your desktop machine. If you, after this presentation, or basically after this day, if you would go to saucedemo.com on your Chrome browser on your desktop machine, you can even create an installable of the Sauce Demo app, which is not the same as a browser. It's basically a single application. Something that you could also verify, responsive to any screen size. Well, if you're currently developing a web application, that's also something that you need to verify. Can it basically resize properly? You can also verify providing a custom offline page. Does your company want a specific offline page? If the end user never visited your page, what should you show your customer? And also one of the things that from the technical part is, can you install your application? Is it possible, yes or no? Then there's also an additional list from WebDev, which is provide a good offline experience. Is it fully accessible? This is also really important. Can you use your mouse on a desktop browser, but can you also use the gestures that you have on mobile devices? And please, gestures, it's always something that people forget to test. If you're going to do some automation on mobile devices and also on browsers, please do not always use the scroll into view option, basically a JavaScript injection to scroll. To be honest, I've never seen an end user inject JavaScript to scroll to the bottom. Try to do some gestures. Try to swipe and mimic the behavior of an end user. Otherwise, your end user might be stuck not being able to swipe on your page. Also important, can it be discovered through search? Look into also the input types. Provides context also for permission requests. And what I mean with permission request, sometimes a PWA needs to get access, for example, to show you notifications. So you might want to check this on Chrome, for example, on your Chrome mobile device. If you open your site, will I see that permission dialog? If you're not seeing that permission dialog, you know there's something wrong in your application. And follow some best practices for healthy code. Well, this is just an advice from the web dev team. And to be honest, follow the best practices for healthy code. That's something we should all do. Not only for PWAs, not only for web applications, even if we're going to create automation, try to follow some best practices on healthy code. Because if your automation framework is not healthy, well, what are you then testing with? But having said that, if we now think about PWAs and the extra things that we could do, that we need to test, then we could think about this. This is the testing pyramid. You all might have seen this, where we've got our unit test cases. So hopefully our developers create some unit test cases. We've got the service layer where we can, for example, test our APIs, and we also have a UI layer. If we're talking about mobile devices, if we're talking about PWAs, then that UI layer becomes a little bit more important. And that made me think also about a presentation that a good friend of mine, Chrome, gave. He gave a presentation about the mobile testing pyramid. And I want to use that mobile testing pyramid also to think about the situations. What can you test where and how should you test them, especially when we're talking about PWAs. That mobile testing pyramid is based on the top layer. And let me just show you how that works. The top layer, that's basically a UI layer. You need to test it on mobile devices. And again, that UI layer for mobile devices can be divided into 3 layers. These layers are based on what could you test where. So you've got a very broad layer at the bottom, and that one is already for browsers. You can already verify a lot of stuff of your PWA in browsers. Then the second layer would be thinking about testing it on emulators and simulators. So you can already look into situations that you cannot test on browsers, but you might be able to test already and cover in the emulator and simulator part. And then last but not least, also the real devices. What you cannot test on emulators might be able to test on real devices. So let's take a look at all those layers and see the pros, see the cons, and also what you can do for PWAs when you're at that specific layer. And keep in the back of your mind, if you would use this strategy, then every layer will become faster and faster. You're not going to execute every test case on every layer. No, a good strategy thinks about, this is the responsibility of this layer. If I've tested it here, it will work there. Let us focus on this part. And then if we tested it there, let's focus on that part, for example, on real devices. So let's take a look at that. First of all, if we're talking about the strategy for browsers, then pros and cons. Big pros are very, very fast execution. It's a matter of seconds, maybe even milliseconds to start up a browser on your machine and also to execute it. Same also for scalability. It's pretty easy, even on your local machine, to just spin up 10 browsers and to divide all the test cases over the 10 Chrome instances. And also it gives you already an idea about cross cross-platform. With cross-platform, I mean if we're talking about testing PWAs, my advice would be to test at least on a Chrome browser and to test on a Safari browser, and not to test on Chrome that will emulate Safari, because then it's still using the Chrome engine, and that is not the thing that you want, because the Chrome engine differs in comparison to the Safari engine. If we're talking about some downsides, yeah, it's still a desktop browser. There's also no native integration. For example, how will the OS or how will the browser handle the drop-downs? How will it handle keyboard? What will happen with your screen? Will it be pushed to the top or not? Those are things that you cannot focus on in this level. And last but not least, it's basically just not a device. But in the end, you can still use it. So you might wonder, okay, what can I test at that specific level, at the browser level? Well, first of all, what you can do is, for example, test if you can call specific browser APIs. And you might need to have certain frameworks to be able to do that. But yeah, it is possible already at this level where you could say, can I call the push notification API of the browser? You don't need to test the push notification itself, but just can I call it? Because if the push notification API of the browser is broken, yeah, that's not something you could work with. Only do I call it with the right information. You can already do full functional validations. Small features can be tested, but also the complete flow can already be tested here. And there are a lot of accessibility libraries that could help you to do some verification on accessibility. And last but not least, what you can also do here is an initial PWA/performance testing part. And what I mean with that is, take for example Chrome. If you would go to Chrome, you can go to Lighthouse if you open the DevTools, and there you would see the option to create performance, or to basically see the performance of your application. You've got some checkboxes there. You can focus on PWAs, you can focus on mobile, depends on what you check. But if you would check the PWA and would go, for example, to saucedemo.com, you would get a report, and this report already gives me a good idea if this is a good PWA, yes or no. That's already something that you could do. Very easy, not that hard to trigger. It's still a manual action, but yeah, you can already do it. Second thing that you can already do here is basically looking at the responsive design. I'm not talking about the real visuals, I'm talking about the responsive design. And what I mean with that is something that I will show you in a few seconds. And last but not least, you can also toggle user agents. And the combination of that, basically resizing the browsers and toggling the user agents, is something I want to show you. This is Safari. And if I would go, for example, to booking.com, and if I would resize my application, I can already see how the resizing affects the layout. This is something that we could already verify. Is element A underneath element B if I'm on a smaller screen? But you might also know that booking.com has a banner on mobile devices. You can only see that banner if you change your user agent. In this case, I'm saying I'm a user agent with an iPhone. You already saw that the design changed a little bit, and we've got the bar there. This is already something you can verify on browsers, not something you need to do on specific mobile devices. But be aware of the fact that the design in this case is completely different for iPads. So user agents, changing the user agents can already be really useful for you to change. This can be done with automation, or this can be done by hand. And last but not least, like I mentioned, the cross-browser, just use the equivalent desktop browsers to mimic the Chrome behavior on an Android device or the Safari behavior on an iOS device. Last but not least, we've got the overall visual layout. Be aware of the fact that if we're talking about the visual layout, that the look and feel on a real device can be different in comparison to the look and feel on a resized browser. And even between browsers, if I would now say I would go to Chrome and would say, go to saucedemo.com, change the browser and make it mobile, and then say an iPhone, then it might look and feel pretty good, pretty equal to what we would have on, for example, a Safari browser. But if I would show it on a mobile device with Safari, the layout might be different because elements are rendered differently on mobile devices. And one of the examples is, for example, A select box. A select box might trigger the picker wheel on iOS. You don't have that on your resized or emulated browser. So don't use all those screenshots and say, if I emulate it on Chrome, it is perfect on all browsers. To be honest, that's not true. Let's say it like that. I wanted to say a different word, but not allowed to say that today. If we would think about which tool can you use, then you could use whatever WebDriver based tool you want to use. You can use JavaScript language, Java, Python, Ruby, C#, but you can also use the latest JavaScript based frameworks like Cypress, Testcafe, Playwright, Puppeteer, and even WebDriver.io. And you might wonder, why is WebDriver.io mentioned here? It should be in the left one, WebDriver based. Well, this is a framework that can support both, and a WebDriver protocol and also the Puppeteer protocol. And then also the tools that you could use if you're in this browser level are Lighthouse, Axe, and Wave. Lighthouse for the PWA performance report, and Axe and Wave for some accessibility testing. So now that we know this, let's take a look at emulators and simulators. How can you use your emulators and simulators to test a PWA? Well, first of all, the pros and the cons. It's easy to set up. If you have a Mac, you can use simulators. You can download them if you download Xcode, and you can use Android Studio and download all the emulators. So it's pretty easy to set it up even on your local machine. You might have some challenges when you have a Windows machine or a Linux machine if you want to use Xcode, because, well, you cannot run Xcode on those environments. It's also scalable, pretty easy to spin up multiple emulators or simulators. And the advantage you already have here is that you have those native elements of that drop-down box, the picker wheel, the keyboard. And you can even test, for example, GPS or incoming calls, something that could influence your PWA, basically trying to access some hardware, what your application or your PWA might need to do. We need to be aware of the fact that if we're talking about Android, that all Android emulators have a stock version of Android, vanilla or stock, no matter how you call it. It's basically a clean version of Android. But our end users, they have Samsung, or they have UI, or they have LG, or they have whatever brand is out there for Android. They have their own skins, and those skins might influence the way your application looks and feels. Then also, when we're talking about emulators and simulators, there's no real resource usage. So it's pretty hard to say something about CPU memory because you're using it from the host. Yeah, and basically you don't have NFC, Bluetooth, or real network conditions. That's a little bit harder with the emulators and simulators. But if we're talking about this layer, about the emulators and simulators, and we've already tested a lot of stuff on our browsers, what should we test here? Well, if we think about this, then we can think about basically the basic ClickPath. We already covered a lot of functionality in the browsers. So what I would advise you here to do is to say, okay, for example, if you're at that retail store, think about a situation like ordering new jeans. What if the checkout process is broken? If it's broken, it will cost you as a company a lot of money. You cannot sell anything. And if you would compare that to, for example, changing your username or changing your email address, you might think about, okay, what has the biggest risk? What will do me the most harm as a company? And then use that strategy to decide if you should create that test case or should run that test case on the emulator or simulator or not, because you already covered a lot on the browsers. Then we also can verify here the native API integration. And then here comes also the installable. Installable for the application. How can you install it? This is the first part where we can verify that. And you might now wonder, okay, installable, what is it? Well, like I mentioned, I would get back to the installable. This is, for example, an iPhone. If I would go to Sauce Demo, which is what I mentioned, a PWA, you would see at the bottom this share icon. This only works, by the way, when you use Safari on an iPhone or when you use Chrome on an Android phone. It will not work with different browsers on those phones. So if we use Safari, we would click on the share icon. Then we would get a new menu. And in that menu, you would have the option add to home screen. In this case, I swiped it to the top. And when you do the add to home screen, you will get a question like, how do you want to call it? And as you can already see, in comparison to a bookmark, you cannot change the URL here. You can give it a name. I just want to use the same name that it's providing me. It already provides an icon. This is something that you can use with PWAs, provide icons for your application. And if you would click on add, the application will be added to your home screen. And this process is almost the same for Android. If I would now open this application, you could see that I do not have the address bar. I do not have the toolbar at the bottom. So it's pretty relaxed now to use this application. It looks and it feels now like a real native application. So, oh, softbot again. Quick question. Yeah, sure. Please ask it. I love questions. Should I test everything in the browser or in the installable? I think that's a good question. This is something that we've been asked a lot. If I'm able to create that installable, should I test everything within the installable or should I test everything within the browser? But one thing I didn't mention to you is that an installable is basically a Chrome Lite for Android or a Safari Lite for iOS, where you would just have the browser rendering in a certain view, giving you the experience of a native application, but still using or Safari or Chrome. So based on that, I would say, no, don't do it. But if we're talking about visual testing, so if you want to verify that everything looks like it should, especially because you now have a bigger area to cover because you don't have that address bar, you don't have the toolbar at the bottom, then yes. So for functional test casing, I would say verify that you can download the installable, that you can install it, and that it can open properly. But don't run all your functional test cases in the installable because you can already do that in a browser, and that is less flaky, as I would say, than running it in the installable. But when you're talking about visuals, then for visuals, this is the perfect place to verify visuals. So hopefully this was good enough for you. Oh, yeah, cool. That was all. Thanks. Now that we're talking about this, let's also take a look at the visuals. If we're talking about those emulators, then we again need to be aware of the fact that it could render differently on an emulator because it is stock Android in comparison to a real device of Samsung, UI, or whatever brand you want to use. So again, testing visuals on emulators, I wonder if that's the best thing that you should do. What you should definitely do, which is something I really encourage you to look at, is touch interactions. This is the first phase in that pyramid where you could test the touch interactions, basically the gestures, swiping, scrolling, or whatever you want to do, or whatever you think your end user is going to do with his fingers. So which tools can we use? I want to use the same list as before. We could use WebDriver-based tools, like, for example, the Appium-based ones, JavaScript, Java, Python, Ruby. Every language might have a framework. But if we would now look at the native JavaScript-based frameworks, then we only have Testcafe. Testcafe is the only one that can communicate with mobile devices. There's one thing that we need to keep in the back of our minds. Testcafe can only automate a web page, but not the process of downloading the installable or installing the installable of your application. That's not something that Testcafe can do. You can still do that with WebDriver IO, but that means you need to use the WebDriver protocol to test this. So let's also talk about real devices. If we're talking about real devices and the things that you, basically the pros and the cons, when we talk about PWAs, is that you've got full access to the phone. You've got the ability to test all the native APIs, to test everything in offline mode. And you might now say offline mode on Android emulators, I can flip the switch for toggling the Wi-Fi. Yes, you can, but you cannot do that on iOS. iOS does not give you the option on simulators to flip the switch and say disable Wi-Fi. So that's why it's a good situation or a good call to do it here. Also the caching, because then you're using your real device. You could have some caching problems on your device. Be aware of that fact and try to test this. This can still be done in a browser. You don't need to do that in the installable. And you can also look at how is my application basically consuming the battery, CPU, and memory. Those are also things that you could test. And last but not least, for the visuals, manufacturer's secret sauce is already on top of that if you test on real Samsung or real other brand Android device. Downsides might be real device comes with a price, broad range of devices, and it's not always available immediately to procure. I think if you would use a cloud service like, for example, Sauce Labs, you would have the option to run on a broad range of devices. If we talk about which tool, or, oh, sorry, not about which tool. If we talk about what can we test then on those specific real devices, well, the range of test cases will be smaller. So think about usability, think about performance, think about native API integration. And this is also the place where we need to think about the visuals, because we have the real thing here. We've got the real device, real rendering with the real browser. So checking visuals, that's really the part where we need to do this. And then last but not least, yeah, you've got the real manufacturer OS on it. So if we look at the tools, then you would already see that there is no JavaScript-based tool, something which is not WebDriver-based, out there that could help you. Or you need to use something from the JavaScript frameworks, Java, Python, Ruby, or C#, or something like WebDriver.io. You just need to use the WebDriver protocol here to be able to automate it on the real devices. And like I mentioned, I also want to give you some automation examples. So automation examples on how to automate, for example, the installable. So let's take a look at the installable. In this case, I've got the Android device here. The flow for the installable for an Android device is a little bit different. If you want to automate this, you've got two options for Android. Android by default, or especially Chrome on Android by default, will show you the add Swag Labs to home screen, basically a banner. This is something, a native thing from the browser. You can automate that, for example, with Appium. Switching context, click on this one, and then you will get a new screen to say where do you want to store it. If you do not see this banner, you go to the three dots, and then you would get the menu and say add to home screen. Then we might need to automate the flow where you would have the icon here. If we would open it, and you would see basically our application, no top bar, no bottom bar, easy to look and to see how this works. If we think about the flow for iOS, then we need to be aware of the fact that iOS changed its flow between 12 and 14. On 12, we can open the share menu, same as with 14, but the difference is that the way that you now need to find your add to home screen icon is different. Here on the left for iOS 12, we need to swipe to the left to get it. And on iOS 14, we need to swipe to the top to get that add to home screen icon. And then the process after that one is still the same. We see this screen, we click on add, and then we're able to open the application. And when we open the application, you would have the installable. This is something you can automate. It might be complex, but I already helped you here by using the JavaScript framework and basically automating all the steps for you. I will share that one also afterwards. But if you will run this on SaaS, you would be able to run it, see all the commands. And just to give you an example of that, on the left, we would see an Android device where we automated the flow. In the middle, an iOS device, iOS 12. On the right, an iOS 14 device. And I'm now basically automating the installable, making sure that's on the device. I'm able to open the installable also. And last but not least, on iOS and on 12 and on iOS 14, I'm going to remove the installable from the device. Why do I do that? Well, basically, Appium can help you on Android by removing it automatically. iOS, there's currently no way of doing that, so we manually need to delete that one. Also, if you're using Sauce Labs, be aware of the fact, if you're using public devices, as we call it, make sure that you remove it, especially when it is a device or an application which is in development stage before you go to production, a new app, for example, or do the PWA testing on private devices so nobody else can see those applications. If you want to know more about the PWAs and especially creating that PWA installable with automation scripts, please go to this link. Like I mentioned, I'm going to share that afterwards through the slides. The last example that I want to show you here is to test offline mode. Like I mentioned, this will work on Android emulators by using a method which is called toggle Wi-Fi. But if you would go to the Appian documentation and you would search in the Appian documentation, you would see that it is not supported for iOS. So we need to do something smart here, between quotes. We need to basically mimic the behavior of a user that might want to disable his Wi-Fi or his internet connection. So that's the advice that I would like to give you, is that if you need to automate this to verify if the offline mode of your application is working, try to think as a user, create a method. In this case, I created a method which is called toggle Wi-Fi. And I first wrote down all the steps that I need to take to make sure that this will work on the device. Same steps that I would need to take as an end user. Put Safari in the background, go to the settings, do some Appian magic, kill the settings and launch the browser again. And we can do that with a command like go to the background, open the settings with a launch app command, and then last but not least, kill the settings. And you might wonder, why don't we just put the settings to the background and why do we kill it here? Well, if you put an application to the background and you open it again, then it will be in the state that you left it. Meaning if we did all the Wi-Fi magic in step 3 and 4, and we do the settings to the background, then the next time I open the settings to, for example, disable the Wi-Fi or enable the Wi-Fi again, my starting state is different. So my advice here would be to terminate the settings. The next time that you need to enable the Wi-Fi, the settings will start in the same setup. And then last but not least, launch the browser. I just want to show you how this works in automation. As you can see here, I've highlighted the Wi-Fi signals on the devices. Please take a look at on the left where we have the Android one. If we use the command, it will disable the Wi-Fi and you should not see the Wi-Fi anymore. And then I'm going to refresh the page. On iOS, I really need to go through the settings. And you might also wonder why use the settings and why not use, for example, swiping the menu from the top or swiping the menu from the bottom. Well, the settings always stay the same. The way it behaves on iOS devices might differ, especially which menu you need to take. It might differ when we use different types of devices. So I wanted to remove that complexity. So hopefully you've now seen how to automate specific parts also of PWAs. This part about the offline testing can be found here. Again, we will share this afterwards. And hopefully I've given you enough information about the new alternative to native applications and also a strategy if you want to test PWAs, how to test those specific features of PWAs. I realize that I'm already, 2 or 3 minutes over time. So I will be there in the chat. If you have questions, feel free to ask them there. I will try to answer all the questions in the chat. And for now, thank you for listening to me, listening to my voice, and also listening to everything what I've said. And hopefully you've now got enough information to be able to test PWAs if you need to do so.